Girolamo Savonarola was a friar who lived during the Renaissance, who for the last 8 years of his life preached in the city of Florence, the city famous for having reached the grandest heights of art and wealth of the Renaissance, but blacklisted by Pope Alexander VI by 1498 for succumbing to Savonarola's heresy against the church. In 1498, Savonarola was hung in Florence's main plaza, in front of the parliament, his body incinerated in the same spot where only a few years earlier the friar had inspired history's great bonfire of the vanities. Within historiography, Savonarola had figured no less than a saint, a hero, or even more recently, in historian Franco Cordero's words, a terrorist. Machiavelli didn't go so far as calling him a terrorist, but he did describe him as a crafty opportunist who keeps changing with the times and coloring his lies to suit them. He had been considered as either an enemy of the state or a champion of Italian liberty, and the intensity of this division, which the friar provoked, has echoed through the annals of history. Regardless, or perhaps because of, his controversial reputation, Savonarola and the movement he inspired is significant because he and his followers sowed the roots of modern democracy, mobilizing by appeal to a more devout Christian ethic, with the goal of transforming the Renaissance city into a ben commune, or a community of the common good. Europe was breaking away from the medieval papal authority and becoming more culturally and politically secular. But Savonarola's vision was a moral one, even fundamentalist. And after telling the story of the Savonarola movement and its rise and fall within Florence, I will return to the question of whether or not he was a terrorist, and will leave it for the viewer to decide. To begin our narrative, let us breathe fire into this era, long since past. Let us imagine ourselves as a traveler coming through Florence's gates, circa 1495.
A 15th century traveler entered Florence through one of its massive gates, made her way through noisy, malodorous streets walled in by multi-storied houses with overhanging roofs and teeming with people of every class and calling. Gentlemen in doublet and hose, silk-gowned ladies with retinues of servants and exotic slaves, long-robed, sandaled clerics, grimy laborers, beggars, hawkers, cut purses, and gangs of rowdy youth. Passing shops, street corner tabernacles, churches, and formal residential doorways, she soon neared the city's monumental center. In just 20 or 30 minutes, the visitor would have retraced in the city's dense fabric more than 2 centuries of history, from medieval provincial town to the proud Renaissance capital of near mythic fame.
At the time, Florence was under the local rule of the Medici family. The city, by official title, was a republic, and has been a republic since it was founded in 1115. The Medicis, however, clandestinely usurped power over the city's cultural and political scene for 3 generations and were shaping the so-called republic behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the political class with the help of a long list of family representatives who had seats in the Signoria, or Florence's parliament. The city's cultural climate was synonymous with the Medici's aristocratic vision, and Lorenzo the Magnificent, the family's patriarch, ruled Florence from 1469 until his death in 1492. Lorenzo's power was supported by an ancient Italian aristocratic tradition and bolstered by the exorbitant wealth passed to him from his grandfather, Cosimo, who spent his life establishing Italy's most formidable bank. During the rule of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the facade of the Republic only grew feebler and feebler, until eventually, as Weinstein observes, gone was the egalitarian pretense. Like a lord, Lorenzo went about the city accompanied by armed bodyguards, summarily dispensing justice and favors. Gone were most of the old civic festivals, replaced by others that projected Lorenzo's image as the charismatic center of the city. His power was further secured by his reserving voting rights for the male citizens who would be eligible to run for council or administrative post. In other words, the people he chose. Women, on the other hand, were not considered citizens. Indeed, the amount of people who suffered in silence under the firm Medici rule was substantial. There had always been in the city an undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the Medici family, concealed though it was under Republican institutions. To continue our imaginative tour back through time, here we stand beside the spirit of old Lorenzo as he surveys his famous city like a proud prince, reminiscing on his influence and control over the political and cultural sphere, a control that was very nearly irrefutable.
Life had its zest for the old Florentine when he trod the marble steps and shared in those dignities. His politics had an area as wide as his trade, which stretched from Syria to Britain, but they had also the passionate intensity and the detailed practical interest which could belong only to a narrow scene of corporate action, only to the members of a community shut in close by the hills and by the walls, where men knew each other as they passed in the street, set their eyes every day on the memorials of their commonwealth, and were conscious of having not simply the rights to vote, but the chance of being voted for. As Lorenzo looks at the scene before him, the sense of familiarity is so much stronger than the perception of change, and he thinks it might be possible to descend once more among the streets and take up that busy life where he left it.
But change was on the city's horizon, riding on the consciousness of the common people, who nonetheless resented what Lorenzo de' Medici had come to represent. Yes, his money helped to build the first public library and to fill that library with classical Greek texts, translated into Italian for the first time. Yeah, the Renaissance was a time not only for new knowledge, but also major changes in aesthetic sensibility, which Lorenzo encouraged, commissioning artists' work throughout the streets of Florence, where they painted and sculpted the nude human form, amongst other things, depicting humanity as it was once depicted in ancient myths, erotic scenes, and other profane subjects, thus shaping Florence's new Renaissance culture. Through the availability of the new public library and the growing visibility of the commissioned art, humanist education was spread among the laymen and sometimes among their sisters and daughters, and was no longer reserved for the aristocratic elite. This proliferation of ancient Greek philosophy, Renaissance art, and the aesthetic decadence were shaping Florence into ancient Rome's equal, and this to a large degree was considered to be Lorenzo's doing. However, the consciousness of this republic was undergoing, as a result of the cultural boon, what Pocock has termed the Machiavellian moment, when a new republic confronts the problem of maintaining the stability of its ideals and institutions. The problem, as Pocock described, was that Florence was developing a secular political self-consciousness in which the culture began confronting its own temporal finitude and struggled to realize a universality of values within a finite and immortal political structure. The difficulty in situating the culture's deep-rooted, medieval Christian ethics, within a finite and mortal political structure, manifested itself in the latent psychology of the Florentines. People of all social standing, from peasants to the elite, became obsessed with apocalyptic prophecy and the desire to know God's plan. And this burning desire was stoked by the popular preachers of the time, including the infamous Joachim of Fiore. Up until the 1400s, eschatological preaching has been discouraged, mainly through the warnings of St. Augustine, and by his authority it was marginalized, condemned, and even punished. However, in the newly educated people that was coming to view itself through the lens of sacred history, as the daughter and the creature of Rome's ascendancy, speculation about the divine design was irrepressible in this time of ascendance. The four horsemen of the Revelations galloped endlessly through the minds of the populace, and thus through the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Florence. These specters were terrifying the people, who saw them as heralds of the Antichrist and the end of days. This lingering, inherited cultural psychology of medieval faith and its obsession with the end times accounted for a discombobulation in the people during the city's rise of secularism and revival of classical humanism. "160 kilometers north of Florence lay a city named Ferrara, and there in the year 1452, Girolamo Savonarola was born to a humble family of physicians. From an early age, Girolamo was educated primarily by his grandfather, Michel Savonarola, whose Christian fundamentalism had a direct hand in young Girolamo's moral formation. Michel was a court physician and a professor of medicine in the Padua University, and young Girolamo would accompany his grandfather to his royal appointments in the court of Ferrara. These visits influenced the boy, and his grandfather's dealings with the great men of the court really left a bitter taste in Girolamo's mouth. He listened as his grandfather spoke of the men who frequented the courts as abominable. The vices he observed in the attitudes and behavior of the men he encountered lay the foundation of his lifelong antipathy towards the nobility and inflamed his desire to leave the world behind. When he wasn't with his family, instead of spending time with his peers, young Girolamo preferred solitary walks in the country and the company of his lute and his notebooks. In his adolescence, Girolamo's contempt for the world only increased. When he was 22, he wrote a poem called On Contempt of the World, where he reflected upon the humanity that was hopelessly drawn down by vice, greed, by corruption, and by vanity. He began to contemplate more and more frequently about leaving the world behind and giving himself over to God, as, in his own words, the cruelty reached such a heightened pitch that there was no good person to be found. In his written reflections during this time, Girolamo foretells of his coming flight from society. Ah! Make haste to flee these coasts of avarice, this land of savagery. Young Girolamo prayed that God would rescue him and give him guidance. Girolamo Savonarola decided, with the good grace of God, that for him, leaving the world behind meant becoming a Dominican friar. Despite his personal resolve, this was a painful decision for him to make, and he struggled with his choice to renounce the world, because he knew that it would be causing great unhappiness in his family, who wished for him to enroll as a student in medical school like his grandfather Michel. Indeed, Girolamo's decision resulted in a lifelong schism with his family, especially his mother, which was never healed. He did not want to be a physician of the body, but he hoped that God would make him a physician of souls. In a letter to his mother, in an attempt to justify his reasons for leaving his family obligations, he quoted Genesis. "Come, depart from your house and your country and leave all behind."